A few weeks back we saw in Ephesians chapter 1 that Paul said there are some things that can only be seen with the eyes of the heart. Now here in chapter 3 verse 17 that we're going to read in just a moment, Paul is speaking about the heart again. He tells us in chapter 3 verse 17 that we should make Jesus at home in our hearts. Now, we're comfortable with that kind of language as evangelicals. We talk about that a lot, about inviting Jesus into your heart, about Jesus living in your heart. Interestingly, this is the only place in the New Testament where that language occurs. So clearly, this is an important text because it's the biblical basis for that language that we use so frequently. So let's read this text. Last week we looked at verse 16 of chapter 3. This morning our text is verse 17. But let's read the two verses together just for a little context. Remember, all of this, both of these verses are in a prayer. They're part of a prayer that Paul is praying for those believers in the church at Ephesus and for us today. And so look at what Paul prays. Verse 16, our text for last week, he prays this. I pray that out of his glorious riches he may strengthen you with power through his Spirit in your inner being. And our text for today, verse 17, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith. And I pray that you will be rooted and established in love. Paul prays for two things for every believer in that verse. Let's look at them. One is that Jesus would make his home in your heart through faith. And the other is that you as a believer in Jesus Christ will be rooted and grounded in love. Let's take the first one first. Paul prays in the first part of verse 17 that Jesus will make his home in our hearts, that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith is how the NIV translates that. Now usually when we talk about Jesus coming into our hearts, we're talking about conversion. We're talking about that initial faith, where by faith a person trusts in Jesus Christ and invites them into their hearts. But that's not what Paul is talking about here. Paul's writing to Christians. They've already done that. They've already expressed that initial faith where Jesus was invited to come into their hearts. So what is Paul talking about here? He's talking about making Jesus feel at home in your hearts. I mentioned to you earlier that Mary's brother and his wife are coming for a visit today. They're from Mississippi, but he's been up in the San Francisco area. They have for a church music conference, and they're driving down to see us today. We've known for a while that they were coming, and so all week Mary has been getting the house ready for their visit. And she was thinking about what to feed them while they were here, and they're both big coffee drinkers. So she said, when you go to the store, buy extra coffee. Make sure we've got, we're stacked up on coffee. And then once she told me, she said, they like to eat grapes, so get some grapes. Make sure we have grapes here for them. And she's gone around the house and she's cleaned up. She's getting everything ready. Now, why is she doing all that? Because we want them to feel at home, right? We want them to be comfortable when they're in our home. We want it to be a good place for them to dwell for this little bit of time that they're going to be here. And so the question I want to ask you this morning as we're looking at this verse is Jesus at home in your heart? Not did you invite him there, but is he at home there? A lot of Christians are more than happy for Jesus to be in their hearts, but they want to keep him in the guest room, They're fine for him to be there so long as he's locked up in the guest room, and whenever a crisis comes, they let Jesus out of the room and say, come on in here, Jesus, come to the big house and take care of the problem. And then as soon as the crisis passed, they want him to go back to the bedroom because they don't want him to have full access to every part of their lives. Paul is praying here that you and I, as believers in Jesus Christ, will give him free reign in our hearts. Give him the key to your heart and tell him, Jesus, this is your house. That word dwell that Paul uses, that's an interesting word. I don't know if all of your translations have that. The NIV does. It says that Jesus will dwell in your hearts. That's the idea of being a permanent resident, not just a visitor to come in when there's when there's trouble, but that he will dwell there as a permanent resident. So ask yourself this morning, is there anything in my life, anything in my heart that makes him uncomfortable here? I was watching a reality show a while back. I was just channel surfing, and I happened upon a show on one of the networks. It might have been the Discovery Channel. It was about real estate. And it was about this realtor in Dallas, Texas. She's one of the leading realtors in the country in terms of, how much money she makes. So she's considered to be one of the best real estate agents in the country. And they showed her going to visit in a home. This couple, they wanted to sell their house. The man had just retired. It was a big fancy house, and they were going to move to a smaller house out in the country. And so they showed her doing all the things that a real estate agent would do to help somebody sell their house. And she said to them, and of course there's a camera crew and they're recording all of this, she said, let's just take a walk through the house and take a look at it. See what needs to be done to get your house ready for sale. So they walked into the first room, and she looked around, and she pointed up to the corner and said, you see those spots up there? That'll need to be taken care of. And the guy said, I've lived in this house for 16 years. I've never even noticed that before. And then they walked into the kitchen, and she looked around the kitchen a little bit, and she pointed down to the place. And she said, you see the crack down there? That'll have to be fixed before you can sell the house. And then they went into another room, same thing. It took her about 15 minutes to find all the things in the house that these people had just become accustomed to. And that's what happens to us. Little by little, we become accustomed to things that would make Jesus uncomfortable in our hearts. And we just grow used to them. And so here's Paul saying to us that Jesus doesn't want to just be a visitor in your heart. He wants to dwell there with free reign. So ask yourself, is there something in my life today that would make Jesus uncomfortable? Is there anything that he would say to you today, if I'm going to dwell in your heart as a permanent resident, that needs to go? And if he's saying that to you today, then it needs to go. But let's look a little deeper into what Paul is saying here. This goes a little deeper than just things in your life that would make Jesus uncomfortable. Paul says something very specific in this part of the verse. He says that Christ would dwell in your heart through faith. Now again, he's not talking about that initial faith for salvation. He's talking about living by faith. He's talking about day-to-day faith. We enter into the Christian life by faith, but we also live the Christian life by faith. In fact, Paul tells us in the book of Romans in chapter 14 that for the Christian, anything that is not of faith is sin. We've seen in Paul's writings that it's through faith that we navigate the spiritual world. You remember what he said in Ephesians 1, that some things can only be seen with the eyes of the heart. That means it's through faith that we navigate in the spiritual world. The book of Hebrews tells us that it's only through faith that we can see what is unseeable. Paul writes in 2 Corinthians chapter 4 that it's only through faith that we can distinguish between what is eternal and what is temporal. We know that it is only through faith that we know the difference between the truth of God and the lies of the devil. All of the spiritual blessings that God gives us are appropriated through faith. And so Paul says here that Jesus wants to dwell in your heart through faith. Now, what does he mean by faith? We normally think of faith as belief and confidence and trust, and those are all good definitions. They're all part of it. But I asked myself that question this week as I was writing this sermon. What does Paul mean here? And so I went up and looked up the word. Now, I've looked up the word for faith before, dozens of times. But I found something this week I'd never seen before. The word that the New Testament writers use for faith, which means basically to trust, that's the idea. It comes from a word that is much older than the New Testament in the Greek language. And more than just meaning to trust, it's a word that means to bow down. To be so overwhelmed as before a king, to bow down in submission. That's Paul's idea here. The idea of being brought to one's knees in submission before Christ. Paul is telling us here that Jesus dwells in the heart of the one who submits to the will of Jesus. That when we bow down before Jesus and say, not my will, but thine be done, that's when we're living by faith. And so ask yourself today, are you living by that kind of faith? Not just the kind of faith where you trust him, but the kind of faith where you are bowing down in submission before him and saying, whatever you desire for my life, that's what I desire. Whatever you want for me, that's what I want. And so that's the first phrase, that Jesus will dwell in our hearts by faith. And then look at the second phrase there in verse 17. He prays that we will be rooted and grounded in love. We would call that a mixed metaphor. He's taking examples from two different realms to make his point. He's taking one word, rooted, that's from agriculture. And then he's taking another word, grounded, that's from architecture. Takes those two words to make his point about our relationship with Jesus through faith. He says, first of all, that we are to be rooted. Now, we all know what roots are, but what do roots do? Well, roots give stability. It's the root system that enables a tree or a plant to withstand stress. It's because of roots that a tree can stand firm and is planted and fixed and established. And roots give nourishment. It's through the root system that nourishment is brought into a plant or a tree. Now, Paul is talking about the foundation of your life here. About having roots that go down deep into the ground so that both of those things will be true. That you will be established for when the storms of life come, and that your roots will go down into a source that gives nourishment and strength. You know what the deepest roots on the planet are? I looked it up. There's a fig tree in South Africa. It has roots that go down 400 feet. It's out there in the hot desert sun in Africa. Roots that go down 400 feet. The reason it does that is the tree grows over a cave. It's known as the Echo Cave. And it sends its roots down through dirt and rock and shale to go into the cave. Because though the soil is poor soil, inside the cave there are hidden resources. And it sends its roots deep down into those hidden resources of the cave. And when the hot desert sun beats down on it, the fig tree thrives because it has roots in hidden resources. And when the wind blows and the storms come up, the fig tree survives because it has roots that are planted in hidden resources. Let me tell you something about life. And you know this already. Life will knock you down like that. In an instant, everything you have can be taken from you. In an instant, your life can be turned upside down. In an instant, everything that you leaned on in this world can be taken from you. You better have some roots that go down into hidden resources. Because when you do, you can withstand the storms of life. And Paul is saying here that the only resources that enable us to withstand those storms of life is to be rooted and grounded in the love of God. So that's rooted. And then grounded, it's an architectural word that Paul here uses here. Refers to the foundation. He describes that which lies beneath and refers to something that is permanent and secure. Any architect will tell you that the most important part of a building is the foundation. In fact, there's a saying that architects have that you can't go high unless you go deep. The foundation has to be deep for the building to go up. Paul uses a word here that conveys a picture of a house that is firmly fixed on a foundation that will not be moved by the storms of life. It pictures the believer as being firmly founded on a foundation so that it goes up and up. That song that we sang today, The Solid Rock, that's the idea of Paul's word here. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. On Christ, the solid rock I stand. All other ground is sinking sand. That's Paul's idea here. Now, both of these words, rooted and grounded, they tell us something about our relationship with Jesus. Jesus is our rock. He's our foundation. We are grounded upon him. And he is our hidden resource, our root. Now, what does he say we're rooted and grounded in? Well, he says we are rooted and grounded in love. And that's the agape word, not just love, human love. He's not just saying love makes the world go round. He's talking about a specific kind of love here, the love of God. He says we are rooted and grounded in God's love. Now, what he doesn't say here is almost as important as what he does say. He doesn't say, for example, that we are rooted and grounded in doctrine. Now, doctrine is very important, of course. But I've known Christians who could recite Christian doctrine front and back, but there was nothing of the love of God in their hearts. You know, Satan is orthodox, right? Satan knows the scriptures. He has all the right beliefs, knows all the true doctrine. He just doesn't submit himself to any of it. Paul's not talking about orthodoxy here as the foundation. He doesn't say rooted and grounded in knowledge. You can have a wall full of seminary degrees, and yet nothing of the love of God is in your heart. Paul says, for example, that knowledge without love leads to pride, 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1. He says that we can have all the knowledge of the world, but that if we don't have love, it's worth nothing, 1 Corinthians 13, 2. And so, yes, we should strive to grow in knowledge of the Word, always, daily, weekly. We should strive to grow in knowledge of the Word. But that knowledge should always be toward the goal of helping us to love God and to love others. Paul doesn't say grounded in Christian service. Christian service is important, and often new Christians are put to work as soon as possible, and that's a good thing. We all have gifts that we are to put to use for God. But Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 3, that Christian service without love profits nothing. And he says, even if I give my body to be burned, but have not love, it profits me nothing. He says we are rooted and grounded in God's love. God's love is the fundamental grace. It shapes our motives, it determines our actions, and you will know that you are dwelling in the love of God, rooted in the love of God, and that Christ is dwelling in your heart when you start loving people the way Jesus loved them. There was a movie that came out in 1998. It was called Ruby Bridges. And it's based on a true story of a real-life girl from New Orleans. She was the first student to integrate the schools in New Orleans back in the early 60s. And that poor little girl, she had to go to school every day, walking a gamut, a sidewalk with racists on both sides, screaming at her, yelling obscenities at her as she was escorted by federal marshals into the school building. And then they'd be there to take her home at the end of the day. This happened every day. There was a psychologist from Harvard University, internationally known. His name was Robert Coles. And he volunteered his time to counsel that young girl, to just be available to talk to her. And he came down to New Orleans. And at the end of every day, he would meet with her and ask her how she was feeling and try to gauge how traumatized she had been by all of this. And he would watch her on the news each day, because they were showing it live on the news as that young girl would walk into the school each day, escorted by federal marshals and the people screaming and yelling at her. And one day, as he's watching on the news, he sees she stops. And she starts saying something, but there was no audio. He couldn't tell what she was saying. But she stood there and talked for a little while and then went into the schoolhouse. And so that night when he was meeting with her, he asked her, it looked to him like she was saying something to the marshals. And so he asked her, what were you saying to the marshals this morning? And she said, I didn't say anything to the marshals. And he said, yes, you did. I was watching. I saw it live. Just before you got into the schoolhouse, you stopped, you turned around, and you said something to the marshals, and then you went inside. And she said, I didn't say anything to the marshals. And he said, well, who were you talking to? And she said, I was praying. I was praying for those people who were yelling at me. And he said, wait a minute. You're telling me that with that mob of people screaming at you, that you stopped to pray for them? And she said this. She said, yes, my mama taught me that when people speak mean of you, you pray for them. Just like Jesus prayed for the people who spoke mean of him. I can't think of a better example of what Paul is talking about than what that little 6-year-old girl did. When Jesus dwells in your heart as a permanent resident, not a guest locked away in the guest room, but when he dwells in your heart by faith as a permanent resident, there's no room for hatred in your heart. When we are rooted and grounded in God's love, the love of Jesus just comes out of us, because Jesus has free reign in our hearts. And when he's dwelling in our hearts by faith, his love will be expressed through us. When we have our hearts rooted and grounded